My name is Jennifer Ellert. I work for Metro Blooms. We are a nonprofit, and we'll tell you a little bit more about that momentarily.
I'm Lacey Doucette Campbell. I also work for Metro Blooms. We are both landscape designers and project managers.
This tells you a little bit about what we're going to be talking about tonight. The way that our workshops are structured is that for the first 75 minutes, you guys get to relax and listen to us, and we will try and stay on time. We're going to talk a bit about resilient yards, and then we're going to ask you if you'll just hold your questions for the second half. We have a ton of material to get through, and we always tend to go a little bit long. So if you'll hold your questions during the second half of our workshop, you'll be talking to individual designers like Lacey and myself and 5 other designers that are going to be here this evening, as well as master gardeners and master water stewards, so you can get help and answers for your own individual properties. So you'll get plenty of time to individually have your questions answered. All right, everything's working. Great. So we want to give you an idea of what we're going to talk about tonight. The goal of our Resilient Yards workshops, we want to encourage you to create a more resilient yard. We're going to be discussing the importance of watershed-friendly gardening practices that improve quality of life in neighborhoods. Ultimately, these practices go a long way to protecting our upper Mississippi watershed. That's the goal. And finally, we want to inspire you to create more ecologically functioning landscapes and to talk to your neighbors about it as well.
And you guys are part of a wonderful group of people. Since 2005, we've had over 10,000 people attend our workshops. We do a survey every year. Last year, 60%, a little over, planned on installing rain gardens, or we're in the process of installing rain gardens, and 68% were planning on implementing a alternative lawn. So
Awesome.
A lot of people got excited about those things.
This is what we're going to go through tonight. We're going to answer some questions for you. So what is resilience? Secondly, why are we talking about it, and how are we applying it to landscapes? Then we're going to give you pieces of a resilient yard, which is what you can do at home to help make your yard more resilient. We'll show you some project examples, and then we'll give you all the resources that you need to help get your project in the ground. So to give you an idea of who we are, Metro Blooms is a nonprofit. We have been in a nonprofit for over 30 years now. We have a focus on water quality and community. We provide on-site consultations, landscape designs, maintenance services, and we manage many neighborhood installation projects. We're working to restore a community's capacity to respond to environmental threats and the impacts of climate change through improved green infrastructure and increased community resilience.
We also administer the Blue Thumb program, Planting for Clean Water. That's a partnership of over 40 private and public organizations. And the goal of Blue Thumb is simple. It's just to encourage property owners to put native plants and clean water practices into their yards and properties.
So you might be wondering, what is resilience? Why are we talking about it? It can be defined as the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties or toughness. You can also think about it as the ability of human and natural systems to function under change. So what is that change? Change can come from environmental or social stresses. The goal of resilience for cities is to create systems that don't just bounce back from a difficult situation, but that bounce forward and that are able to improve in the face of stress. And urban resilience can be called the capacity of individuals, communities, cities to survive, adapt, and grow in the face of chronic stressors and acute shocks.
And so a chronic stressor would be something that kind of wears away at the day-to-day fabric of a city or community. That would be something like high unemployment or an ineffective public transportation system or food or water shortages, whereas an acute shock is more something that's a one-time larger shock on the system, like an earthquake or a disease outbreak or floods.
So what do resilient systems need to bounce forward, like we mentioned, and to improve when faced with stressors such as such as urbanization and climate change?
They need diversity, which is listed up there. And diversity means the ability to support the maximum number of organisms in an environment. The example we have is that gorgeous prairie, which has a wide diversity of plants. Redundancy, which is to replace a failing piece of the system or one that just doesn't seem to be adapting very well. The examples for that, again, would be the prairie. There's lots of different plants there, so if one fails, there are plenty of others to feed the pollinators that need that as a food source. And then also our urban road system. So if there is a road closure in one road in downtown Minneapolis, you always have several other ways to get around the city. Another piece of resiliency is anticipation. So that just means thinking towards the future, and if you might have some challenges in the future. And our example here would be, in a personal sense, if you take care of your body and you exercise and eat well, you tend to recover better if you have an injury or a disease.
That's great. And so we also talk about feedback loops and how important they are for resilient systems. We all know that unless we're monitoring the results of a system, then we really have no way of telling if it's working or not. We like to use the storm sewer system as a good example for that. So unless we're monitoring whether or not our storm sewer system is becoming overburdened by increased rainfall, then we have no way of understanding our effects. So feedback loops are also really important for improving resilient systems. Social cohesion, and so I know you all came here to learn about rain gardens, native plantings, but we are going to talk a bit about the importance of social networks. And I'm not talking about Facebook, but social networks, as in speaking with your neighbor, and the importance of having a healthy social network. There was a study that said that the #1 factor affecting long life is, more so than diet and exercise, is social cohesion, which is pretty amazing when you think about that. So what you're doing in your yard can directly affect your neighbors, not just their yard, but then their quality of life. And then maybe it's something you all come outside and talk about. So creating resilient landscapes can have a big effect on social cohesion. And then finally, we want to challenge the tragedy of the commons. And so this is the idea that the notion that your small plot of land really doesn't have an impact, or what you do on your property doesn't have an impact. And we're here to kind of challenge that tonight. And we would say, yes, it does. So creating a resilient landscape can really help improve water quality or improve pollinator habitat. So we would, you'll see that kind of throughout our presentation this evening. And then resilience in your yard. So let's zoom in and apply all this resiliency theory, this broad theory, to your yard. And let's talk about why we need that. We need resilient yards because they're part of this kind of larger whole ecosystem. They provide diversity, redundance, and anticipation, all of those things that we just talked about. And they can create social interaction in the face of changing climate and increased urbanization. If one part of that system fails, the rest of the overall system can still recover.
So a resilient yard reduces water pollution, and it recharges your groundwater aquifers. It provides habitat and food for pollinators and other important wildlife. It also reduces the urban heat island effect, which we'll talk about a little later, and provides shade, as well as it conserves resources, including time. So that means you're spending less time and less money and less materials to keep your yard running, more so than less so if you just had nothing but lawn. And then it just makes you feel good. Flowers and butterflies make most people feel good, so that's another really, I think, high benefit to having a resilient landscape. So, call for resilient landscapes. We've told you a bit about what it means to have a resilient landscape, and now we're going to talk about why it's important. So some of the chronic stressors that we had mentioned before, a big one is climate change, and particularly part of climate change is extreme rainfall. And so we have increased heavy downpours that lead to infrastructure failures, bank erosions, and flooding. The map that we are showing here is a map displaying that there's been a 37% increase in the amount of heavy rainstorms in our region in the last 50 years, so it's been increasing over time. And within the country, our region and then the Northeast are the ones that are most highly affected by that. And you can see in the news this spring that the Northeast has had, many really volatile nor'easters. So that's kind of highlighting that that's happening. And then this is a more local example Jennifer's going to talk about.
Yeah, and just if you can't read that right there, that says 76%. So that means that heavy rains in the Northeast are going to increase by 76%. As Lacey said, this is a local example. This is in Duluth. This is in 2012. When there was some massive flooding, and you can see the effect that it takes on infrastructure, and so that's from floodwaters really undermining pavement and then washing it, and then overloading the storm sewer system, and once they've undermined that, then it washes it out, creating quite a bit of damage.
Here's a couple more just local examples. This is Minnehaha Creek, and so one picture shows that the stream has overflowed its banks and is encroaching on somebody's yard. And then here's a really kind of extreme example of bank erosion, and that actually has a negative impact on the wildlife that and the critters that live in the river itself, because it increases the amount of particulates in soil and changes the temperature of the water. So another climate change related stressor is warming temperatures. In the US, Minnesota is actually the state that's most impacted by warming temperatures, the warming temperatures effects of climate change. And what that means is our nights are not as cold and our winters are not as cold anymore, which you may have noticed. Sometimes it's kind of nice, but it can be bad too. The cold states are impacted more by these increasing warming temperatures than the southern states or warmer states are. Warmer temperatures, especially in the winter, make our environment more inviting for invasive species such as the emerald ash borer, which you'll kind of see an example of right there. And then, so another big chronic stressor that we deal with that threatens resiliency is urbanization. And a piece of that is the urban heat island effect. And so that just means that the temperature is increasing in the core of cities and the surrounding suburban area because of the large amount of impervious surfaces such as concrete and steel, and the lower amount of pervious surfaces such as trees and plants and areas like that, parks. We end up consuming more energy in order to keep our homes and buildings cool, which also can have a negative effect. And the warmer stormwater temperatures that run off of all this impervious surfaces actually have a negative effect on the aquatic life that we have in our lakes and rivers and streams, because it changes their reproduction and metabolism.
And just to explain this, this photo here, or this example, what this means is that the temperatures in the urban core of Minneapolis at night are generally 3 times warmer than the surrounding areas. And that's due to excuse me.
3 degrees warmer.
Not 3 times. We're not there yet. That's why we're talking about resilient landscapes. They're 3 degrees warmer, and that just shows you the difference that urban landscape has in kind of radiating that heat again at night.
And so here, focusing in even further, focusing on impervious surfaces within urbanization. So Jennifer, if you want to click our little animation we have here. So we're showing water that's flowing off of a typical suburban urban house, and then flowing off of the property and into the road. That's traditionally how we have designed our housing area, our houses and communities, is to just get the stormwater out, away and off as soon as we can and away from our house. And we want to really stress with this slide that most communities do not treat their stormwater. So when it hits the road and it picks up all of the particulates that are in the road, which means leaves, grass, trash, oil, pet waste, salt, things like that. It goes into your storm system and then comes right out into your rivers and lakes and streams untreated, which means that there can be a lot of negative effects to the streams and rivers. Our example here is Powderhorn Lake in Minneapolis, and we're displaying some algae blooms that happen in the summertime. If you've ever been around a lake or stream when there's an algae bloom in the summertime, you know that it's pretty gross. You don't really want to use that body of water at that time, and it can also be dangerous as well because it increases nasty bacteria.
We have some fun facts about the amount of average runoff that can come off of a property. So if an average property has about 2,000 square feet of impervious surface, that's generally a fairly urban property. It may not have a very large footprint. About 40,000 gallons of runoff per year are generated from all of those impervious surfaces. That equals 2 times the amount of water that the average Minnesotan uses in a year to wash their hands, wash their dishes, do their laundry. You could equate that to 4 school buses full of water over the course of a year. So there's quite a bit of water that can come off an urban property within 1 year.
So just a quick chart here to talk about salt. We mentioned salt before. Salt is a big problem in our lakes and streams because it does not break down. It just accumulates and accumulates. So here the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency is doing a study of some of the urban lakes and how much salt they are accumulating, and at what point they will hit the limit of no longer being freshwater and no longer being viable for the living creatures that are in it. And we're already seeing a couple that are edging into that limit. So another effect of urbanization is habitat loss. This map right here shows pre-settlement native plant communities, and we have it kind of flipping back and forth here so you can observe it again in a second. So right here shows the remaining native plant communities that we have. As you can see, there's only a few little tiny patches that are kind of surrounding where there's lakes and rivers still. So we really have lost a lot of what we really had some high quality habitat before. That loss of habitat has contributed to the decline of the monarch, which you see on our beautiful prairie blazing star right there on the left. Monarchs have declined 81% since 1999, which is pretty amazing. And then habitat loss has also contributed, one of many contributors to bee colony collapse disorder.
And another effect of the loss of habitat, we think this is an amazing fact. It takes 5,000 to 6,000 caterpillars for that chickadee to raise that clutch of babies. So you have to have the habitat to support all of those caterpillars so that that chickadee can go find them and bring them back and forth to raise that clutch. So without oak trees supporting those caterpillars, we're going to be losing chickadees.
So we talked about little patches in that last slide there. So we want to look at connections and how can we create more connections. And what we have is talking about how rain gardens and related projects can really enhance the amount of viable habitat for these pollinators and other animals. So the first map, that's existing known high quality habitat within the city of Minneapolis. And as you can see, there's just little teeny tiny patches. And when we say known, we mean if you have like an amazing native planting in your backyard, we may not know about it. So these are the ones we know about. So they're only just little bits here and there. The second map is showing a 200-meter buffer around all of that existing habitat, and that's basically as far as a small pollinator can fly. So you can see there's a little bit of connection here and there, again along the river and the lakes, but there's a lot of just dead space where pollinators just aren't going to have the energy to fly across to find new food. And then the third map here is all of the Metro Blooms rain gardens that we have installed over the years with workshop participants. And as you can see, the amount of habitat kind of explodes right there. So what you're doing in your little patch of yard is really important and makes a big impact.
Yeah, we have a long way to go. We can see where we need to be focusing on getting some more rain gardens and native habitat in, but like Lacey said, that this just goes to show you that those small plots make a really big difference. Okay, next we're going to talk about the pieces of a resilient yard. This is like your toolbox. We've given you the doom and gloom, and we've bummed you out, but now we're going to make you feel a little bit better.
Not too bummed.
So just to start, some small behavior changes can have a really big impact on your yard and how it affects kind of the larger watershed and ecosystem. And these are in your workbook. If you all haven't noticed, you have a workbook inside that folder that you received. And in the next few pages, we'll be talking about different features that are in your workbook. We don't follow along with that exactly, but a lot of this information is in there, so don't feel like you have to furiously scribble things down. So just a couple of behavior changes that I want to mention that are really important. The first is keeping grass clippings and leaves out of the street. This is very simple. Those grass clippings and leaves, if you mow towards the street or if the leaves fall or maybe you're blowing them and they blow them towards the street, when it rains, those leaves wash right down into that storm drain in that photo we showed earlier, and they go right into a nearby lake. They also have a lot of phosphorus in them. And so phosphorus is what often triggers those algae blooms. So keeping your grass clippings and leaves out of the street can have a big impact on downstream waters. Another thing that I feel like is very important, and maybe it's because we're coming out of winter, so it's something I see a lot right now, is avoiding excess salt usage. So if you can avoid salt, great. If you need to apply it, very sparingly or responsibly, do so. One way that we use, personally, we use grit to keep, instead of using salt. So we use chicken grit. We buy it at a local Ace Hardware. And I actually have my kids go shake it out on the sidewalk, and it's a good activity for them. And then when the ice melts in the spring, then I can sweep it up, put it right back in a 5-gallon bucket, and use it again. So it's also really cost effective. So we are going to go through all of these next. These are just the tools in your tool shed. We talked about behavioral changes, and these are more physical changes that you can make to your yard. Can you guys see? Okay. Okay. Before we do that, one thing we want to talk about is where you could place these kind of new physical improvements in your yard, and we're going to talk a little bit briefly about a site assessment. Hopefully you all received some homework, kind of an idea to bring a picture of your yard so that when you talk to your designer, you didn't? Okay, just let us know after. Okay, perfect. Then we are good at adapting, and we can work from we can draw it on a napkin and we can figure it out. But what a site assessment does is that helps you think about how you use your yard. So the function of your yard, where do you gather? Where does your mail carrier walk? Where do children or grandchildren play? That's to think about kind of how your yard is being utilized. Another way to think about your yard is the hydrology. So where does the water flow? If you have erosion or if you have a wet spot, that's something you're probably already thinking about, is where the water flows in your yard. Think about if a raindrop falls on this part of my roof, which downspout is it going to come out of? And how much water is flowing in different directions. And then sun and shade. So this is how you define full sun and full shade, for those of you that are curious about that. But then having an idea of what part of your yard gets the most sun and what part is under a tree. And then in an ideal world, you would end up with something like this. And this gives you an idea of where you could maybe make some of these improvements, like rain gardens, alternative turf, and we'll be talking about those shortly. But this is something to think about when you're talking with your designer in the second half of the workshop.
We have a fun lawn fact, too, if you want to hear it.
Oh, yeah.
American lawns now cover 3 times the amount of space that are, wait, is that right? 3 times larger than any irrigated crops in the U.S. So that's basically a lawn the size of Texas. So, and they don't really do much in terms of function for positive ecological function, right? So if you have a lot of lawn and you have some lawn that you're not using, if you're actively using it, great. But if you have lawn that you don't mind converting, think about using native plants or native perennials, or using a stormwater feature.
So we're going to go through all of those tools in the tool shed now. And the first one to talk about is rain barrels. You can see that we have on the slides a little $sign. That's just going to give you an idea of kind of the least expensive to the more expensive ways that you can change your yard and make it more resilient. I mean, budget is always an important thing to consider. But the first thing we're going to talk about are rain barrels. So the typical rain barrel will hold about 50 gallons of water. An average downspout on a roof will drain about 300 gallons of water in a 1-inch rain event. A 1-inch rain event is the most common rain event that we have in Minnesota. So you can tell that a rain barrel would fill up very quickly. The key to using a rain barrel is to using the water in it. So make sure you put it somewhere where you can then easily utilize it. I have a soaker hose attached to our rain barrel so that as soon as it fills up, I can turn the valve and just let that water come out slowly. You need to elevate a rain barrel to be able to get water out of it. You want to be able to physically put a watering can underneath it, but it's gravity fed, so it's not going to come out with pressure like water comes out of your hose. And if you don't feel like waiting for that water to come out, like I don't, then you can attach a soaker hose to it. But the key, again, is making sure that you're emptying your downspout. Something else that's really important is that all rain barrels have an overflow, so that if they do fill up, there's a place for that water to go. You want to direct that overflow away from your foundation. Because in most of these pictures, if it's while you're collecting water from a downspout, it would overflow right towards your foundation. So depending on your rain barrel, you want to make sure that you connect a hose to that and direct that away from your foundation.
Maintenance is pretty simple with rain barrels. You just need to make sure periodically throughout the season you clear off the top of it where there might be leaves or debris that would collect, so keeping the inlet clean. And then in the fall, you want to make sure you disconnect it so that it doesn't freeze during the winter. And then just kind of clean it out and sanitize it so the water that you have in there is nice and clean and safe.
So downspout redirection, this is kind of one of the most impactful things that you can do to help keep stormwater out of the storm sewer system. We talked about the overburdened storm sewer system. So the picture on the left, what these guys are doing, this is one of our projects. What they're doing is they actually added a gutter right here to this garage. Otherwise, the water that had previously fallen on that part of that garage just went right into the alley. You can see the alley right here. And it went right into the storm drain. So what they're doing is then going to attach this downspout to it. Instead of having the downspout come straight down, they're going to redirect that downspout to a rain garden inside the backyard. And so even if they don't have a rain garden in there, just redirecting that downspout can have a really big effect on reducing how much water comes off a piece of property. And that's just a kind of quick and easy thing to think about. And then overhead conveyance. This is a fancy word for bringing your downspout over your sidewalk. If you live in a tight urban property and you have a sidewalk running right by your house, as a lot of people do, and then the water comes out of that downspout. It's really icy in the winter. You're tripping over it. This is a great solution for changing where your downspout goes. You can just bring it over the sidewalk. And this one's beautiful. I mean, they did a wonderful job here encasing it and then creating kind of a pergola look, and it comes down a rain chain and goes into a little bioswale here. So it looks beautiful, and it solves kind of a physical problem there as well. And here they're just, these are just covered in vines, so it's really just making it more decorative, but again, they're just going overhead, going over the sidewalk to make it easier. Let's see. Okay, next we're going to talk a little bit about kind of underground downspout redirection. So you do have a couple of options as you're moving water away from your house. One of those is to bring your downspout and have it be caught in a catch basin. I'll go into catch basins in the next slide in more detail. But the key to this is that there is somewhere for the water in this pipe to go. Some people do put pop-ups. I am not a big fan of a pop-up, so I always prefer that there needs to be a way to outlet this pipe. So if you have a really flat yard, this may not be the best option for you. This is something you can talk to your designer about in the second portion of the workshop to get kind of individual attention. The other important thing about this is that that pipe has a slope, so there has to have a fall to that pipe so that water in there is moving and it's not stationary. In our beautiful illustration here, in this case, it's going to a rain garden. And we'll talk about rain gardens in a couple of minutes, but one of the things we want to show you here is just that it has a really flat bottom. And that's key to a rain garden, is that the bottom of the rain garden is flat. French drains can be really helpful, especially in an area where you have two houses that are close together and you have a lot of water draining to that area. Everybody's downspouts point to that area, and it's really wet. If you're able to put in a French drain, the way that works is that pipe is perforated, so it has holes in it, and it's covered with, it should be lined, just so everybody knows, so that sediment doesn't get into that pipe. You would dig a trench, and it's got washed rock in it, and that way the water goes into this French drain and then collects in the pipe, and the pipe needs to have, again, a fall on it so that the water has somewhere to go so that you can get it out from in between those two houses. It can help dry up an area that was previously causing kind of water problems between two basements. Okay, we'll next talk about those catch basins that I mentioned. These can be found at kind of any home improvement type store. A catch basin has this grate on it, and you can see where the downspout comes into the catch basin. You can cut it shorter than this. It doesn't have to be quite that long, and when Lacey talks about maintenance, she'll kind of tell you why. You connect the corrugated pipe here, and then it heads right out to your rain garden. This atrium grate is really important, and I really like how the picture that we have has it being screwed onto that pipe, because that is a good way to keep it connected. The reason is that critters like to make their way up into that pipe. It can get kind of covered over with mulch, and then it can get clogged, and you either don't want it to back up, or if you have a heavy rain, you don't want to be killing a bunch of chipmunks as that gets washed out. So that's another reason to put that grate on there. A couple of things that are important about the catch basin is that it does have this area down here for catching sediment. And then this is a way to kind of have a downspout adapter if you want to go from a metal downspout to having kind of a flexible pipe on there.
Yeah, and the grate is usually pretty easy to take off, so that way you can periodically, it's kind of like a rain barrel in terms of maintenance. Periodically throughout the season, you'd take off that grate and just scoop out whatever happened to be collecting in there. And then in the fall, again, you want to disconnect it and make sure that it doesn't freeze over the winter. So that's why that is actually kind of cut a little too low, because you're going to want to get a downspout extender and just kind of put it off into your yard. If you have a sidewalk that's nearby and you don't want to create a pool of water and an ice issue during the winter, then perhaps a catch basin is not the best solution and you want to go with overhead conveyance. But again, talk to your designer.
Another way to kind of direct your runoff as it's moving across your property is through a swale. A swale, if you are familiar with a county road that has a ditch on the side, well, that's a swale. It's very simple. It's a way to get water off of a surface and then to collect it and then usually to move it throughout a landscape. So in the case here on the right that has the dry creek bed, they have quite a bit of slope to their yard so they can keep water moving through. And then in the case of when it's dry, it also looks lovely and it's a nice landscape feature and it gives kind of the idea of water moving through the landscape even when it's not raining. Some key things to remember is you can line these with landscape fabric if you want to Suppress weeds. If you do use landscape fabric, always pin the sides of it down. You don't want that to come up and start flapping around. That never looks really good. Rock size is really up to you, and depending on how much water that moves through there. If you have a lot of water moving through a creek bed like that, then you want to use larger rocks. The smaller ones will get washed away. And then a swale can be just something simple like a vegetated swale. So maybe there's water coming off of this road here, and then this is planted with irises and a few other species. So it's very simple, really elegant, but a great way to deal with stormwater. And then finally, this is a much larger example of how you can catch water from these residences and these residences here. They're creating habitat and also a little bit of privacy for each of those buildings, so they can be a great landscape addition. And then we're going to talk a little bit about channel drains. So channel drains can be expensive. We have that right there. And that just really depends on when and how you're applying them. So a channel drain is a great way to catch runoff that's coming from a driveway or a large paved surface. Sometimes that can be the hardest type of runoff to capture. Channel drains can be retrofitted and installed in an existing concrete or asphalt driveway. You would just simply saw cut that pavement and install the channel drain. The thing is the driveway has to have a correct pitch. So if the driveway is too pitched or too pitched in the middle, then the channel drain won't work. So this is something to talk to your designer about. But in each of these cases, there's somewhere for that water to go. So as the water goes down, I think we show it best here, as the water comes down this driveway, it can go into the channel drain, be collected, and then go right over here into a rain garden. And that's really keeping quite a bit of runoff out of the street. This is a project that we did on one of our Blooming Alleys projects. And so these are two different properties. They have a shared driveway. And then this channel drain collects runoff from this driveway and both of these garage roofs. And it comes here, it goes under a pipe, it goes under this little area where they store their recycling bins and trash cans into a pipe and then right into a rain garden just outside of that. So that's a great way to capture that stormwater. Did I forget anything? And they're plowable, which is important in our winters. So permeable pavement. To give you an idea of what that is, permeable pavement is a system of especially engineered pavers. They have small spaces between them. And under the pavers is a lot of washed rock and gravel that can be up to 2 feet deep. And so not just any paver can be called a permeable paver. So if you have a brick walk, that's not necessarily permeable.
Next slide, that's just a section cut of it so you can see kind of all the layers of rock.
Exactly. Yep. So you can see here that the water can fall into these cracks and then come down into this washed rock area. This acts like a reservoir, so it can fill up, all the air spaces between those rocks can fill up in a rain, and then it can drain out. Some soils, if they're really heavy soils or if it's expecting quite a bit of drainage, may require a drainage pipe to move any excess water away, but that's not always necessary. And back to this example, thanks Lizzie. The great thing about permeable pavement used in this case is that this whole driveway doesn't have to be permeable. It's pretty expensive to install permeable pavement. So in this case, they're sort of maximizing the benefit of it because they're not repaving their entire concrete driveway, just using a strip of it to capture the runoff that's flowing off of the driveway.
And then the maintenance for permeable paving, there's a little bit of maintenance involved. It's not too bad. Usually in the spring and the fall, you would go through and Jennifer mentioned that there's this aggregate rock it's in between the spaces of the pavers. You would go through and just make sure that that isn't clogged up. So take like a screwdriver or something sharp and kind of fluff it up. If there is some sediment in there, which there may be, I mean, that's the purpose for it to catch some of that, you would need to vacuum that out and then clean off the aggregate. You would just use a regular shop vac that you or your neighbor might have, or you can rent from Ready Rents. You would vacuum that out and then clean off the aggregate and put it back down. If you don't want to take the time to clean off the aggregate, that's fine too. You could just put some new rock in. It's definitely something you can band together with neighbors if other neighbors have permeable paving and take an afternoon and do it.
So we looked at that one. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about soils and the importance of soil health. We can't overestimate the importance of healthy soil in creating a landscape. If you didn't know, you'll want to know this. There are more soil microorganisms in 1 teaspoon of healthy soil than there are people on the earth. And that's a pretty amazing fact to consider. So lots of bacteria, algae, protozoa are living in soils. And compacted soils they can happen in urban situations. They can happen from walking and playing on a lawn over time. But one important thing to know is that water can't filter as easily through a compacted soil as it is through a healthy soil or a decompacted soil. I mean, I think this picture is a great example because you can see how the roots of this plant really reach 5 centimeters in the compacted soil on the left. They're reaching down to 30, 35 centimeters in this sort of healthy profile of soil on the right. A healthy soil can store more water in a flood or in heavy rain, and they're more resilient in droughts for that reason, and they also can provide more nutrients to plants. So you may be wondering, do I have healthy soil? How do I get healthy soil? How does that happen? And so we have just a few tips here for creating healthy soil, and then that's again something to talk to your designers about if you have questions about the drainage of your particular soil type. So mulching leaves in place in the fall. We have a great resource that falls to the ground every autumn, and we don't always utilize it. Sometimes we bag it up and just get rid of it. But those leaves are, in a natural ecosystem, would decompose and provide nutrients back in the soil. So one way to use them is you can actually run your mower over your lawn. So if you have a tree that has got maple leaves falling on your lawn, you can mow them repeatedly. And then what that happens is that really breaks them up a little bit so they don't mat down quite as much. So you can mow them. In this case, this person has raked them up, put them in the wheelbarrow, and then they're using them as mulch. So not only is that you're keeping from having to bag and throw away all those leaves, but then you're also not having to buy as much mulch, so that can be a cost saver as well. Lacey, do you want to talk about living mulch?
Yeah, I can do that. So another option is you can have ground covers that are living mulch, and those are basically just slow growing or slow kind of spreading, or fast if you want, plants that can provide the same effect as mulch. So the one that springs to my mind is wild strawberry. That's a really great plant that you can use. It takes full sun to full shade. It spreads out nice and evenly, and it's low growing. So if it's a place where you're not going to be doing a lot of heavy walking, or just maybe the borders of your garden, you could use that. And then kind of going along with that is just using, planting deep-rooted native plants. They're going to aerate your soil and really increase the soil health. Another little pollinator benefit to using either native plants or ground covers versus mulch is we have a lot of native ground nesting bees here in Minnesota. And ground nesting bees actually have a really hard time penetrating through the shredded wood mulch that a lot of people will use. But if you have bare spots in your garden or you have ground covers, then they're able to create homes and make a home in your yard.
And they can burrow through that leaf mulch much easier than they can go through kind of a hard wood chipped mulch. We don't want to underestimate the importance of trees also. Adding to your tree canopy, we want to just go over a couple of these pictures really quickly. We talked about the urban heat island. So you can see this picture here. This is kind of like a typical urban tree canopy. There's not a ton of cover. You've got some boulevard trees, maybe a park here, but not a ton of cover. So this is one of those small things that you can do in your yard that can affect the greater whole, and that's plant a tree. It has a huge effect. One thing we also want to talk about when we're talking about trees is to go back to the topic of diversity. That was something we mentioned earlier in terms of resilience and creating a resilient landscape. This is an example of the Harrison neighborhood in Minneapolis, and all of those orange dots are all ash trees. So you all know the story of the emerald ash borer, I'm sure. And so here's an example of planting one species in a situation, and that makes that landscape, which is in this case the boulevard tree landscape, very vulnerable to, in this case, to invasive species. So creating diversity and adding diversity back into those landscapes can help make them more resilient so that if we get new pests, then we're not going to have that landscape be wiped out. I think we've learned this twice now. We had Dutch elm disease, we have emerald ash borer, so hopefully we'll be planting a more diverse tree landscape now. So that just kind of ties that back to the idea of creating a resilient landscape and the importance of that. Let's see. And then we just have a great example here of a really wonderful shaded area. So just talking about reducing that urban heat island effect, really cooling it down, and that just also looks like a lovely place to be. So talking next about some of the trees, this is by no means a comprehensive list, but one thing that I just want to note about this list, we did take it from U.S. Forest Service, some research done by the U.S. Forest Service and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, And you'll see some species on here that you may not be familiar with. They are native to North America, but they may be native to areas a bit south of us. But as our area sort of starts to warm even more and more, some of these species are going to be more prevalent and more adapted to climate change in our area. You'll notice that there are some pine and some maples that are not on that list because they were really no longer going to be as adaptable to climate change in our area.
And then when you're thinking about selecting a tree for your particular landscape or yard, you want to think about how it's going to fit into the overall landscape, and think about if you could maybe mimic the natural layers that a forest would have, where there's overstory trees, understory trees, shrub layer, and then a perennial layer. And we kind of chose these photos on the bottom because they seem to illustrate that really well, that layering. I just want to point out understory trees are really great too if you have a kind of a small urban yard and you don't have enough room to have a large overstory tree. I have a teeny tiny yard in South Minneapolis, and I have in my back a pagoda dogwood and an eastern redbud, which are two of my favorites to design with as well, because they're just beautiful specimen trees. They have flowers in the springtime, and they support wildlife. The eastern redbud, it's one of the first things to bloom in the spring, and that supports, newly emerging queen bumblebees. So I like to think of that when I watch it bloom in the spring.
We want to talk briefly about some shrubs that we are big fans of. If it has an E next to it, that means it's edible for humans. So in addition to some of the trees that we listed, shrubs can also provide all of those things. They can provide windbreaks, they can provide shade, they can provide habitat for birds, but they can also provide edible sources of fruit for both humans and for wildlife. You might have to compete with any birds for these like lovely service berries here. And then blueberries, raspberries. We have some winterberry. You can see this robin feeding on that right there. Do you have any favorites there, Lisa?
Cardinal.
Excuse me, cardinal.
I also really love serviceberry. I know some people think it's almost overused at this point, but it's a wonderful 3-season plant because it has beautiful white flowers in the spring, and then the berries, this beautiful orange color in the fall. So you just kind of can't go wrong with them.
We're going to touch briefly on turf alternatives, but we do want to promote our turf alternatives workshops. So if this is a subject that you're very interested in, Metro Blooms has a number of additional workshops that go into this in more detail. This is a fairly detailed topic, and how to convert your lawn to kind of be a turf alternative is somewhat detailed. So please, by all means, attend those if we don't answer your questions on this topic here. If you're wondering what a turf alternative is, it's really an ecologically friendly alternative to kind of the typical Kentucky bluegrass lawn. It can reduce inputs, it can need less gasoline, irrigation, less mowing, improve infiltration and percolation in that area, and it can provide food and habitat for wildlife and pollinators depending on what type of turf alternative you go with.
And there's 3 kinds that we talk about and focus on. One is the low maintenance turf, which is made up of fine fescues. That has the same kind of function as a Kentucky bluegrass lawn, except for the grasses themselves are a little bit longer. They grow a lot slower. Some of them can either be low mow or no mow at all. And they have deeper root systems, so they're just more adapted to changing climate and need less mowing, less fertilizer, less water, less everything basically from you. The second one is pollinator or bee-friendly lawn, and that is a mix of forbs that you can either mix in with your current lawn or just put in, completely. And that would be examples like violets, clovers, things that you probably already have a little bit of in your lawn. They're really important sources of food for pollinators throughout the season. And then the third one is perennial ground cover. And so that is just removing turf and using something that's low growing or slow growing and spreading, like I used the example of wild strawberry earlier.
So this illustration, which is pretty fun, is going to go through how you can convert your lawn to an alternative turf. But one thing that we want to stress is that there are many ways to convert your lawn to an alternative turf, and the right choice kind of depends on the condition that your lawn is in right now. That's really important, and how much time, kind of money and energy you want to spend transforming your lawn. We're going to walk through this option that works for healthy lawns that are not currently overrun by weeds, and they'll benefit from the reduced competition in your existing lawn. So one of the behavioral changes, if you remember that we mentioned earlier, was keeping your mower blade higher. The reason that we had mentioned that was so that it actually helps keep your lawn from drying out. but this is the one time that we're going to let you mow your lawn really short. And the reason that you're going to do that is that it's going to expose as much soil as possible. So you'll mow your lawn really short. You can rake away those grass clippings so that you're really exposing that soil to light. And the reason is that you really want to, when you're spreading any seed, have that seed impact the soil. You need positive seed-soil contact. You can water those new seeds until they sprout. That's going to be very important. Of course, they're not going to sprout with a nice rain. And then you want to cut back on watering and stop fertilizing once they sprout. And then again, never again mow your lawn below those 3 inches. We're going to talk briefly about boulevard gardens and the impact that they can have. So a boulevard can be a very difficult place to landscape, but it also provides a great opportunity for both adding native plants to the landscape, which are very hardy and very tough, and then providing potential areas for rainwater capture. So the typical urban boulevard has a grass dam, which you can see here. So in a lot of cases, you can have a lot of ice on your sidewalk because really that water isn't able to get off the sidewalk, or there's just water sheeting down the sidewalk in the summertime. One thing you can do is excavate the boulevard to create kind of a concave shape here. If you want to keep it turf, you can certainly do that. And then another thing that you can do is create a boulevard rain garden. In this case, that boulevard has been excavated to about 3 inches below the level of the sidewalk or the curb. Any lower than that is not necessary and also could be a tripping hazard. The one key thing to a boulevard rain garden is that any plants in there need to be below 30 inches in height. That's really a safety feature so that cars along a road can see kids playing on the sidewalk in case a kid decides to run into the road. We want them to have, a visual on the sidewalk, so you don't really want to plant anything really tall.
And then just depending on where you live, check to see if you need a permit to put in a boulevard garden. Some places you do, City of Minneapolis you do. They may have other ordinances as well for how deep you can go.
So rain gardens, this is something that we at Metro Blooms install quite a bit. And I'm going to go through this briefly, but this is really like a slice cut through a rain garden. A rain garden is not much more than a depressed perennial planting. It's made to capture and infiltrate rainwater runoff coming from those downspouts that we were talking about earlier. The wonderful thing about that is the roots from all of these native plants are breaking down pollutants, and they're also providing habitat at the same time. There's a couple of key features to a rain garden that I want to point out really quickly. One is this flat bottom. I mentioned that earlier, so that water can infiltrate all along the bottom. The other is the outlet. So there's going to be a point at which the rain garden could potentially fill up, and when it does, you want to know where it's going to overflow. So you want to make sure that you have created an overflow that is a little bit lower than where the water is coming in. And generally, you want this overflow to be facing away from your basement, away from your house, where it can run downhill if the rain garden does fill up. We'll go through installing a rain garden a bit more. So we're going to go through all of these to show you kind of the best place to put in a rain garden. The first thing that you want to do when you're installing a rain garden is to do a percolation test. This is in your book on page 13, so don't worry if you're trying to remember all of that. But the way that this works is you can dig about a 9-inch hole, fill it with water, and then let that water drain out. Fill it again, because we want to do this test in the saturated soil condition, kind of a worst case scenario. Fill it again, and you can put, as we show here, a popsicle stick or a pencil on the side of the hole. You can let that drain down for 1 hour, and then come back and measure that distance. And then after 24 hours, then what you can do is multiply that by 24, and so you'll know how quickly your soil will drain in 24 hours. The reason that we do this is that we don't want to create more of a mosquito problem than we may already have in Minnesota. So we do want these to be, the water to not be standing and to drain below the level of the soil. Compost, we go back to talking about healthy soils. If needed, you can certainly add organic matter to your soil. This is a great topic to ask your master gardeners who are going to be here tonight to see if that's something you might need in your soil. And then siting and sizing of rain gardens. So this is a couple of pretty important ideas here. There's a few key things to remember. You want to stay about 10 feet off of your basement or foundation with a rain garden. That's because water doesn't infiltrate into soil in a straight line. It will spread out, and so you want to stay kind of equidistant away from whatever you're next to. So if your basement is 10 feet below ground, stay 10 feet off of that. If you have a 4-foot deep crawl space, stay 4 feet off of that.
We use the 4-foot rule too for garages usually as
Yes.
well, so you can get a
Good
little
point.
closer to them.
Generally, you want to stay away from trees to avoid the drip line. That's not always the case in a small yard, but some trees can take some disturbance better than others. So that's something to talk to your master gardeners, your designers about tonight. You want to look at where water is coming from. So can you capture water from this downspout? Is that a good location for it? Or are you having a lot of runoff come from your sidewalk? So that's something to think about. And then always think about utility lines. Where are those coming into your property? Have those marked.
Call Go for One. That's a
Call
good
Go-
way to find out.
One thing to remember is that Go for One does not mark private utilities. So if you have a power line that runs from your house to your garage, they aren't going to mark that. So you'll need to do a little investigation to find that. And then sizing your rain garden. We have a really simple equation. Again, this is in your workbook about how to determine the best size for your rain garden. So you just take the area of impervious surface draining to the rain garden, divide that by the depth that you know that your soil can infiltrate from your percolation test, and then that gives you your garden size. And we go through that here. So if you have 450 square feet of drainage area, it's 6 inches deep, you know that your percolation test showed you that you can drain 6 inches in 24 hours, then you're going to have a 75 square foot rain garden. I do want to say that the average residential rain garden is about 6 inches deep. There isn't much need to go any deeper than that. It can look a bit out of place in a residential situation. You'll see some commercial rain gardens that can be quite a bit deeper, but they're draining a lot more water. So that's something to keep in mind. Do you want to talk about that edge, the planted edge?
Yeah, the planted edge is good to keep. That way you can actually have some more areas that are maybe not as heavily mulched for pollinators, which we mentioned before, like ground nesting pollinators. It's also a great place to use as your base point for actually doing weeding and maintenance, which you'll want to do throughout the season. And because you uncompacted that soil, you're not going to want to be like stomping around in there or walking around a lot in the flat part of the basin. So if you have an edge that you can actually stand on and reach through, that's pretty useful to have. The other thing, just real quick, is the shape of it I wanted to talk about too. It doesn't have to be a rectangular shape. You can kind of pick any shape you want, just like any other garden bed. You can extend an existing garden bed that you already have. That's a really nice way to kind of meld it into your existing landscape. Yeah, again, talk to your designer more about that.
This is just to give you a little bit of an idea of how to get the depth of your rain garden correct and how to make sure it's level. So we install a number of rain gardens, and some people have big fancy lasers, but more than anything else, we use a string and a line level to install a rain garden, and that's really all you need. If you have a 4-foot level and you've dug your basin and you can put it in the bottom of your basin to determine if it's level, great, by all means, do that. Another way to measure your rain garden is to put in 2 stakes here at the end where the water comes in and at the overflow, because you want to make sure that your overflow is in fact lower than where the water is coming in. You attach the string, hang your line level right there, and then you can measure from the string down, and if you have a consistent number in the basin, you know that you're level, and this should be a little bit lower than right here. So it's just a really easy way to construct your rain garden.
And don't be afraid to measure several times. We install a lot of rain gardens in the summer, and a lot of it is, a little bit of science, a little bit art. So when you're doing the actual shaping and flattening of the basin, you might have to flatten it out and rake it out and then measure, and then flatten it out and rake it out again a few times, which is kind of meditative almost.
So a lot of times we get asked the question, can you put a rain garden on a slope? And the answer in general is yes, if it's not too steep. The reason that you can put a rain garden, or the reason it's helpful to put a rain garden on a slope, is sometimes the wet spot in a yard is the very bottom of the yard where all the water is going to, and that's not always the best spot for a rain garden because those soils are already saturated with water. So actually putting a rain garden a little bit uphill from that can really help alleviate sometimes if you have kind of flooding issues. This just goes to show you how that can be really beneficial. So one of the things that are generated when you install a rain garden is a lot of excess soil. And if you don't necessarily have a place to use that soil, if you're building your rain garden on a slope, then you can balance your cut and your fill, and some of that soil can be used to make a berm, so that's going to help hold in the water in your rain garden, and then kind of use up some of that soil that you're going to have left over from that installation.
The berm is one place where you can stop around, actually, so
That's
that way
true.
you can compact it down and make it, be used as a dam.
And we would recommend stomping on your berm.
Yes.
Okay, so garden edges. We always say edges are your friend. A clean edge, like this brick edge shown here, this cut edge, which is just simply, you can take a shovel and make a nice clean line between your lawn and your mulch, or the sidewalk edge is creating a nice clean line for the rain garden. So considering edges is something, it's helpful and important. I think with any garden bed, I think lawn can tend to creep in, so having some type of edge can be really helpful. This is just a great example of a rain garden where the water from this house is actually coming out. This is the rain garden right here, and it's coming through a pipe underneath, through this wall, and then it's coming out to the rain garden here. Mulch. The one thing I will say about mulch is that double shredded hardwood mulch is the kind of mulch to use in a rain garden. The reason is it doesn't float. That's very important. And it mats together, so that's going to help suppress weeds. Okay. Let's see if we can get this to play. This is a great, before we start playing this, let me just say that this is a great installation video. So this really goes through, it's pretty quick, but it'll go through how a rain garden is installed. That didn't work. Let me see if I can do it on this computer here.
Oh, good. Yep.
So you can see we're cutting the sod. That's a sod picker. You can rent one of those from Ready Rents, or you can rent a motorized sod picker. They're digging the basin first. When they dig the basin, they're digging it flat. I think they stopped to measure a couple of times, so that was pretty quick. And then they dig the side slopes, and basically then you're taking excess soil out of the side slopes, and at the same time they're turning it to just loosen the soil in general. Checking and measuring, that's what they're doing right there.
Once you remove all the soil too, you want to loosen it as far down as you can get the shovel, so that when you're decompacting all of the basin itself.
We always recommend that you mulch the rain garden before you plant it. That mulch is providing it keeps you from compacting that soil that you've just turned over, made it really loose, and that mulch keeps kind of the impact of your foot from really compacting that soil again. And then you just move the mulch away and plant into that. And then they've got, you can see their downspout, and they're going to make a little rock channel to bring their water in. And then water it.
See, so easy.
They're feeling good. Oh,
Takes 2 minutes.
Really, no problem. All right, so finally we're going to talk a little bit about native plants. This is a component of a rain garden that's very important. You saw them planting the plants at the end, and your question may be, why are they helpful in a rain garden? Well, they're going to be adapted to our native conditions, and the plants that you plant in the bottom of a rain garden are very important. They're going to be able to survive when it's really wet, when you have a heavy rain, or even in a drought when it dries up. So selecting native plants and the appropriate plants for your rain garden is really important. We'll go through some of those real quick. And they also have really deep roots. And the benefit of deep roots, which leads me to this next slide, is that what those deep roots do is really provide channels for that water to get deeper into the soil. So over time, the function of your rain garden can actually improve as your plants mature and the roots get deeper. If you have ever come to one of our rain garden workshops, you have seen this slide like 1,000 times. All of the master gardeners back there are shaking their heads. They've seen it a lot, but we love it because we want to show you Kentucky bluegrass, and we're trying to convince you to put in a rain garden, and this is why. So this is the roots of Kentucky bluegrass. They're a couple inches deep. This is purple coneflower. That's a pretty common native plant, and its roots go down 5 feet, and it's nowhere near the deepest rooted plants, native plants that there are. So this just gives you an example of really how those roots underneath the soil make a difference.
And just body comparison. 2 inches is about like the length of your ear. Obviously, that varies person to person. And then I'm about 5'2" right now, so that's the length of the coneflower roots, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Using real examples.
The other thing that we mentioned earlier was improving soil quality. So every year, a portion of these roots slough off 30%. And decompose. 30%. There you go. And so that's really adding organic matter back into your soil and improving that soil. So when you're planting, just some design objectives to keep in mind is using a mix of native plantings. You can plant in masses and in drifts. It's like a family picture, shorter people up front. You want some of your shorter plants in the front, larger ones in the back. I love this switchgrass, the coneflower here. It's just a really nice one. When you're selecting your native plants, You can start with small ones. So in 3 years, these little plants are going to be about the same size as a 1 gallon. So that's a real cost saver right there. And we have a lot of information in your workbooks about different plant sales or different places where you can buy native plants. If you saw Minnesota Native Landscapes was outside earlier. And then something else to consider is planting at least 3 blooming plants per season. So 3 in the spring, 3 in the summer, 3 in the fall. And that way you're providing a continual nectar source for pollinators throughout the season.
A good one-stop shop for learning about where all the plant sales are this spring and early summer is the Minnesota Horticultural Society's website. They have a calendar of events on there, and there's probably at least 20 plant sales that you could go to. And you can, it's great because they have a large variety of natives usually, and they tend to be cheaper than some of the nurseries or some of the shops. And you can sometimes find rare natives, which is kind of neat. So.
And I'm going to go through these kind of quickly because they're in your workbook, but I just want to explain what this diagram is. You'll see that in there. This just shows you these plants that are shown here are suitable for kind of a drier soil condition. In your workbook, we have an example for sun. We just have the shade one showing here. And they bloom. These are the ones that bloom in the spring, summer, and fall. So this is an easy way to select plants for your rain garden. These are the plants that are going to take some inundation with water, but then are fine also drying out. And then again, in your workbook, you'll see the example for these are the plants that are going to do best in the rain garden. A plant that would be happy here will not necessarily be happy here. So maintenance, we just would be silly if we didn't talk briefly about maintenance and how important that is. When you first plant your rain garden, you are going to need to water it. So especially if we have a dry summer, you're going to want to give your rain garden about 1 inch of water per week. If you're wondering what that looks like, if you have a rain gauge, set it out there. If the 1 inch of rain does not fall from the sky, then you need to put a sprinkler on it, and then wait till the rain gauge fills up and you've got 1 inch. I would say that's the minimum that you should water your rain garden for the first 1 to 2 growing seasons until those plants get established. If you don't have a rain gauge, you can use a tuna can or a cat food can. That's about 1 inch deep. It's a really easy way to do that. Pull the weeds when they're small. It's so much easier. Spend 5 minutes if you're walking by your rain garden and you see a few small weeds. Just pull those out. When they get to be about hip height, boy, do they get really hard. So it's really better if you would just go ahead and pull those weeds when they're small.
Jennifer and I were talking about this the other day, and we kind of likened it to cleaning your house.
Yes.
If you don't clean your house for a month, you have many hours of cleaning, right? It's awful. But if you pick up things as you go a few times a week, then it's much, much easier and less soul crushing.
I think that I weed my rain garden better than I clean my house.
Yeah, I do
according
too. I
to
totally
that.
do.
Yeah, for sure. And then, so if you do have a pipe coming into your rain garden, you want to keep those clear. So if you don't have an atrium grate or regardless, you want to make sure that the inlets and outlets to your rain garden are clear. And then over time, if you see that one plant is just really not making it in your rain garden, that's often the case. The plants that are like it there will decide that they love it, and some may or may not make it. Then make sure you replace those empty spaces. Remulch as you need to, but then over time the plants will cover more and you should need to mulch less and less. There are some pollinator-friendly maintenance practices that you can do. I really like the look of native plants in the wintertime. There's not a lot to look at in Minnesota in the winter, so having these beautiful plants with snow on them just really creates a lovely landscape. You can cut those back in the spring, so if you like to leave those and that looks nice to you, then leave that all winter long. It's providing habitat, it's providing cover for birds, it's providing seed heads, and then cut those back in the spring. There are some plants that have hollow stems, and then those are great spaces for some of our native bees to nest. They'll actually nest in hollow stems. And cup plant, bee balm, coneflower, you can all cut those to about 18 inches, and that still leaves enough hollow stem for some of the native bees to nest in.
So we're going to show you a few project examples just so you can see what a rain garden that's been installed and been in for a couple of years looks like. And
Do you want this?
a good excuse to look at some lovely plants as well. So for this rain garden, you can see the location where it's next to, it looks like a house and garage. And then it's probably I would say this one's maybe a year old, maybe up to 2. You can still see there's a little space, in between the plants. They haven't completely filled in. One thing about just another key component of maintenance at about 3 years, which is when your garden usually reaches maturity, you're going to have to probably split some of those plants that like to divide themselves. And actually, that's a great excuse for getting your friends or family or neighbors to start their own rain garden, because then you can share free plants with them. You can see right there the outlet that's going out to the street with the little rocks right there, so they thought about that. And then in all of these examples, we really just wanted to stress beyond the just beautiful colors of the plants and the beautiful textures and heights, the plant massings. So you can see there's some black-eye Susans here that are massed. There's some asters right there. And the benefits of massing are 2- or 3-fold. They just have a bigger visual impact, both for aesthetic purposes for people and then also for pollinators. They're able to see them from further away, and they're able to get more food from one stop. So that's really important. The other benefit is from a maintenance perspective, is especially in the spring when these plants are coming up, you may not exactly be sure what is what or what is weed and what isn't, but if you have these masses of plants that are desirable, then you'll kind of quickly be able to tell which one, which one of these does not belong. And then just here's another example of kind of a bigger planting along a boulevard that could mimic a prairie. Again, you can see the kind of massings of the different plants, and the fact that some parts are green. So this planting, when it was designed, they thought about blooming throughout the seasons. And then here's just another one where you can see here's 3 months post installation. This is a shade garden that's next to catching some garage runoff. And so, the plants haven't quite filled out yet. And then just the following year, they have filled out quite lovely in a full manner. So then we're going to move on to our last part, which is resources for a blooming future.
Yeah, we wanted to let you know we do have, I believe that we have rain garden books available for sale.
Yep.
Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah.
Good. So if you're interested in installing a rain garden yourself, we give you a lot of information. This goes into it kind of in even more detail. It's a great resource. I have one. I use it all the time. I have spilled coffee on it, and the pages are stuck together, and I still use it to show people project examples. So that's just a great resource. These are, and what we can do, I think, after the presentation is we can always flip back to the slide and leave it up, so you don't have to scribble all these down. But these are just some great resources to go to for information about contractors. If you're looking to have somebody help design and install your yard, a rain garden, then bluethumb.org, which is that educational arm of Metro Blooms, is a great resource for that. If you'll go to the next one.
Yep. Also, the folders have, when you have a chance, you can look through. There's just chock full of information in your folder as well of Blue Thumb partners.
So we wanted to make sure that we reminded you of a few key things that we mentioned. So if you didn't leave this workshop with a lot, but kind of decided you would make a couple of small behavioral changes, these are the ones that we would suggest to you to start with. The first would be to redirect your downspouts, just to even put them onto your lawn or off of your paved surfaces and onto whatever non-paved surface you can. That's just a great start. Mow your lawn high. That's the 3 inches that we talked about. Plant a tree. We went through that quite a bit. Consider turf alternatives. Better yet, come to our turf alternatives workshop. Plan a rain garden. Think about that. And then get a neighbor to help and get neighbors involved. And then we have one more thing. We talked a lot about the physical ways that which you can create a resilient yard, but we would be pretty remiss if we didn't touch on the importance of creating resilient communities. Metro Blooms in general got its start as a program that encouraged people to grow flowers in their boulevards. This was about 30 years ago. The city of Minneapolis supported that program because they knew that people spending time in their front yards and in their boulevards had another effect, and that was crime reduction. So having more friendly eyes on the street is a way to increase public safety and create a sense of community.
And we're also rediscovering, 30 years later, our roots of, with our neighborhood projects, that the most successful ones are when neighbors talk to each other and talk to them about the things that they care about. So if you decide to install a rain garden or a prairie or a shade tree or any of the other wonderful things that we talked about tonight, please talk to your neighbors about it and why you're doing it. There's so many reasons to choose a resilient yard or pieces of resilience that everybody can get excited about. And even if your friend or family or neighbor isn't excited about, the environmental reasons that it's good to have a resilient landscape, they might be excited about the fact that you save a lot of time and money implementing these practices that we talked about today. They can be beautiful and social and healthy, and they can bring people together and have them have a common good that they can care about together. So, thank you. We'll go